Hello, class. This is Joe, your TA. I hope everyone's doing well. So, for this week's discussion series, I'm going to be leading a talk on one of my favorite topics in all of world history, and that is the Russian Revolution. But to begin, in this first video, in order to fully understand why the revolution happened in 1917, I want to lay a foundation. And to do that, I'm going to be talking about certain aspects of Russian society and the political structure of the Russian Empire, because it's important to understand that, to understand how it failed and how that failure led to a revolution. So, to begin, I want you guys to look at this map of the Russian Empire. And one of the key takeaways is this is a rather large empire. And by rather large, I mean this was one of the biggest empires of the 20th century, early 20th century, that is. It spans all the way from Western Europe and borders on Germany and Austrian Hungarian Empire, all the way to the Pacific Ocean and butts up right next to Japan and China. It is huge, it is enormous, and it is a large logistical nightmare to deal with. Imagine trying to get a message from the capital here in St. Petersburg all the way over here to the far reaches of the empire near the Pacific Ocean. That would take many weeks, even by the fastest railroad system, which is the Trans Siberian Railroad, to get to. The other thing to keep in mind is Siberia is a big tundra forest. It's cold, it's snowy. From me coming from California, like this is what I imagine Michigan to be like Siberian winter, and that's how it's been for the most part. Not this year, but maybe next year. Um, anyway, I digress. So, like large geographical landmass. The second thing I want to talk about is Russian society. So, Russian society and the Russian state is centered around the Tsar. And here we have a picture of the Tsar and his family. So, the Tsar, the term Tsar, the title Tsar, comes from the Russian version of the word Caesar. So, it's harkening back to the glorious days of the Roman Empire. So, in his role as the Tsar, Nicholas II, in his fancy green shirt, is the supreme leader of the Russian people. Like, he is an autocratic, divine leader. And by divine, he just happens to also be the head of the state religion, the Eastern Orthodox Church, in his position as Tsar. So the Tsar is in control of the church and the state. Sitting right next to him, right here, is his wife, the Tsarina. She's going to play an important role later on in our story, but it's important to note right here that she is of German descent, and she is cousins with the leader of the German Empire, Kaiser Wilhelm II. Another key player in this story happens to sit right here. This is young Nicky. He is um, the heir to the Romanov dynasty, and he also happens to be hemophiliac, which means that any small cut, any small bruise can lead him to bleed out and die. And he's the only son. Um, and complicating this whole thing is the fact that the royal family kept this a secret, and only certain members of the royal family knew that he was a hemophiliac. And over here is a famous character in history and anonymy. This is Anastasia Romanov, and her life was depicted in a historically horrible but very entertaining animated film from the 1990s called Anastasia. If you haven't seen it, it's pretty good. Just know that the history is not there at all. So moving on, small point but important point. There's a calendar issue when it comes to talking about the Russian Revolution in this time period, because the Russian Empire used the old Julian calendar, which means they're a few days behind our Gregorian calendar that most of Western Europe uses. So, for example, the February Revolution occurred in the Julian calendar on February 23rd, but for our calendar, it occurred on March 8th. This is a small point, but it's important because for the course of these events, we're going to be talking about it from the Julian calendar, and most Russian historians use the Julian calendar up until the revolution. So moving on, there's three aspects to Russian society that are important during this turn of the century to the 20th century. The first is this is a society in transition. This is a period of intense social and economic change, and it's full of contradictions. People are just trying to figure things out. Second, we have a society of orders versus a society of classes that are competing with each other. This is some of that contradiction. So you have legally established estates. So you have the noble class, the peasant class, the merchant class, the priest class, and the townspeople, artisans and shopkeepers. On top of this, you also have an emerging sense of social class, which is largely based upon the type of labor that you do. So, like, are you a steel worker or a woodworker in that sense? And part of this, why there's a growing social class based on your labor, is because the Russian Empire is going through a massive period of industrialization as a national project. And they're doing this because they're trying to make the empire more powerful and to preserve its role as a European and world power. And like part of this is there's policies enabling like promotion, modernization, expansion, and heavy industry. So an important thing to note, like industrialization is a lived experience, which means that there's people living through having to suffer through this process. Like it's long hours, it's low wages, and it's poor working conditions. So emerging out of this, however, like with labor comes a new sense of self. Like workers develop a sense of dignity and literacy because skilled labor, like working in factories, like you have to know machinery, you have to have certain skills. And from this like development of skills and this appreciation of skills, we see a sense of dignity be established amongst this class. And this sense of dignity leads to like politicalization of workers. Why? Because the state's doing very little, if nothing, to improve the lives of workers. In fact, they're trying to repress any strikes or any protests by the workers who are trying to better their lot in life. And the state actually, in fact, bans all forms of labor organization and collective action. While that's going on in the cities, an important thing to note is a vast majority of the population are peasants. They're living in rural poor communities, and they're land hungry in the sense that like there's not enough arid land to grow crops, so a lot of people are starving. So the peasantry had one goal, and that's land and freedom. And there's the term in Russian right there. And what they mean by this is they want land for those to work, and they want freedom from outside interference and self-rule. They just want to be left alone and grow their crops, basically, and live there in their small communities. But, I mean, there's not enough land for everyone to do that. And because of this, we see a large migration of labor from the villages to the cities, and once they have money, from the cities back to the villages. And what this is doing is it's creating this like organic grassroots like transition of ideas. Like people are being exposed to new things and new cities because like you often don't work in the same city or in the same factory for long periods of time. People are constantly moving around, and from this like we're seeing an exposure to new ideas and the transmission of those ideas across the Russian Empire. So the big takeaway from this first video is the Tsar is the absolute ruler, and he's stuck in the 16th century style of leadership, whereas the rest of the society and the rest of the country is rapidly going through processes of modernity, Like there's worker consciousness being developed, and people are hungry for new styles of leadership. And we're going to see this lead to immense amounts of protest and rallies and violence in the opening decade of the 20th century in the Russian Empire. So I will see you guys in video 2.